Guys, my name is Liz Miller. I'm operations and partnership director at this here tonight at the hub. To see the beautiful thing that there's nonprofits and sort of problem solving, but also to hear the sort of presentation of the EJUSA and some of our community partners. A lot of the organization works to connect and mobilize people all around the community. And that looks a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's helping volunteers get connected to meaningful civic opportunities, or helping kind of collaborate on citywide efforts for the day that we are all talking about. And tonight it looks like helping individuals gain contextual awareness about big important topics in our community. So we are excited to partner with Heath, who I have known since I was 13 maybe, way back in the day. And so really great community organization as we talk about race, not in person, and for. So I feel like I feel like and read it. I will let you say whatever you would like to say about yourself that we come up here. And Sam's gonna give a presentation about some visual joining us via Zoom as well, who are gonna listen to that. And then in the future, I'm gonna come back up and we'll turn into a community.
Good evening, everybody. I'm really going to draw here. So, we're born and raised in Presbyterian. So this is home in so many ways. Somebody thinks to me, last night there was a day there. What are the hundreds? Something to her here, not something important. That's it. So I can be here, also here, and what I very much is. This great important thing, and more than that, is people. These three families that saw last time locally to look at what is just so I think about this more than half of my living are still currently in the church that I grew up at space, still in a huge room within my imagination. I was thinking about this and a lot of things. I remember this. It's Winston-Salem from age to 55 age in front. I was at the single solace in a children's club that goes through Winston-Salem, all Winston literally going from A to C. And there's a lot of what's in the basic special, and there's a lot of what's in the basic working. So it talks about the British Children's Hospital run, it talks about site or go on now. Stocks and other stable things within the city. Presbyterian also in here. And one that I follow the stable and this. At the end of the day is our moments to remember. Yeah. So this grew in my mind all about this. There's this group about this sort of inside books about things that are unique to us. And then we find some way to be on. And you do this person is the one who would arrive 15 plus. This income joke. And it wasn't until the last several years that
it's a kind of a wretched thing for us to have taken this woman, taken her experience, taken what she is, kind of move her into a symbol of something. And to me, she became a flashpoint for a lot of how some thinking and life experiences have developed for me over time, right? And we have these moments of things in childhood, we color them in certain ways, and then they deepen as we grow older. And for this woman, she stands out in my mind. We made her a joke. We kind of made her a symbol. But this is a person. I don't even know her name. I don't know anything about her other than that I would see her and all the assumptions that I might make about this woman. And she represents in a lot of ways, and this is what really struck me a couple days ago, she represents in a lot of ways a failure of some of the ways that we as a society might live. To have somebody that could be so known within our city, to almost have her own hashtag, and yet for her still in that position of, again, what I think was maybe assuredly houselessness or homelessness. So I think about her when I think about Winston. And when I think about Winston, I think about growing up here, learning all sorts of things, learning about the rhythms of the faith. The church that I grew up at, I always say, taught me who Jesus was, taught me what the gospel is, taught me the rhythms of what the faith is and on. And David Winston taught me how to live within, not too big, but a big enough city, definitely as big enough city as I really ever wanted to live in. But Winston is big enough and small enough to be able to see some of the impacts of what happens. And again, that woman represents to me a lot of how I would now think about and talk about how we live as a society. And I would, if she were still here or alive or around, I'd want to ask questions, one of just who she was. But I'd also want to hear and learn about what got her into a place where that was how she lived and moved within the city. What things underneath, both within her life as an individual, and then also the institutions and systems within the city that allowed or enabled something like that to happen. One of the deep dives of places that I've gone in thinking about those systems or those institutions is thinking about engaging the criminal legal system. So here's the bio list that it's okay that you didn't say. But I work for an organization called EJUSA, Equal Justice USA. We're a national nonprofit of 35 people across the country. And what we do is work to repeal the death penalty at the state level and at the federal level. And we also want to help communities think about what does it look like to respond to harm, violence, and not center prosecution, police, or prisons. So that looks like restorative justice. That looks like alternatives to policing. That looks like practicing community safety. It looks like being aware of and engaging the systems and individuals within the space. So EJUSA is not a faith-based group, but my branch of it is called the Evangelical Network. And so my role is to talk and source, empower, and enable Christians, churches, denominations that are thinking about what are the justice needs in their spaces and how can we come under and help those. And so tonight's a really good model of that. I want to come and talk a little bit about some of these themes of race, mass incarceration, and the church, but then situated for you all here in Winston-Salem with 3 groups, 1 state group and 2 local groups that are doing that work. There are a few programs that we do as an organization because most of what we want to do is to come under and point people like you all to that work that's happening within a community so that you can engage that and join with them and link arms with them. 6 years ago in Charlottesville was the Unite the Right rally on August 12th. And there are a lot of stories I could tell about that day, but our family, and at that time our 2 kids, were there in strollers at one of the marches before a lot of the violence. And we got next to where the statue of Robert E. Lee now used to be at that park. And it was an early morning rally. It was about 9 in the morning. And we were looking around, my wife and I. We didn't see any other kids there. And a few minutes later, the state militia was going to come up the road and we would leave and the cycle of violence would spin off from there. But I remember there was a woman there. She was a minister. She had a collar. And she turned around and saw me. And she looked at my kids. And she looked up at me. And then she kind of nodded towards the counter protest that we were a part of. And she said, "We do this," and then nodded to my kids, "so they don't have to." And it was this weighty moment of seeing the organizing, the activism, the advocacy, the embodiment of us trying to speak both against something and speak for something, and doing that for the sake of people now, but also that next group, that next generation. That sent me really deep in a journey of thinking more and more about, again, that deep dive of the criminal legal system. I didn't know much about it until one of my good friends was arrested, was in prison for 13 years. I wrote to him and visited him in different prisons all over North Carolina. And he was my first glimpse into what the criminal legal system was and what it did and the scope, size, and scale of it. So he showed me on an individual level how the system treated individuals, really regardless of what their crime was, in very similar ways. I started seeing some of the dehumanizing ways that he as an individual was affected. But then over time, I started hearing about some of those broader things. And each statistic was a gut punch as I learned about not just what happened with individuals, but also this thing that we use as a term of mass incarceration. And a couple of facts really struck me and still haunt me. One of them is, and you might have heard some of these, within the United States, we have about 5% of the world's population, but yet 20% of the world's prisoners. And so that alone shows within our society that we have this problem, this obsession, this focus on mass incarceration. We imprison individuals more and at a higher rate than any civilization within human history. And it's really important that we hear that. And it's really important that we start to think about why. Within the United States, we have about 2,300 jails or prisons. There's about 2,400 people currently on death row, 135 of them here within North Carolina. And so some of those statistics start to touch on the size, scope, and scale of what's going on. There's about 2 million people as a whole within jails or prisons within this country. We have about 1 million police officers. We have a third of the world's female prisoners. And 1 out of 50 kids has a parent who's in jail. So not only do we mass incarcerate, but keep in mind, we also do it with disparity. This is where that racial equity piece is going to enter in. To talk about the legal system can't be divorced from thinking about some of the racial dynamics that are within that. There are a lot of ways to talk about that, but one statistic that we can't argue with, we can argue about what led to it. But again, another one that facts that within the United States, we have about 13% of our population is Black. And yet about 40% of our population in prisons are Black individuals. We have to ask why that is. And there's only two options. Either something is wrong with Black people. We think that we really got to reckon with that, or something's wrong with the way that we're engaged in harm, or violence, or crime. So I want us to think about prison as this overlap of prison and prejudice. And I want us to keep in mind we incarcerate usually with disparity. So to the church, by the church I mean the Christian church, I want to say a couple things in light of as we think of this system. One is I want to ask the church two questions. One is, who do we worship? And if you think about the Christian church worships a person, worships Jesus. So when we think about who this person is and his proximity to prison, his proximity to the criminal legal system of his day, things get really shocking, right? Think about when he announces his ministry, reads from and quotes from Isaiah, talks about coming to preach freedom and liberty to those in captivity. I used to only think that that was a spiritual salvation. It is that, but there's also this literal freedom from chains, this embodiment of that. That liberty is both spiritual and it's also a literal piece as well. Think about Jesus interrupting an execution. Well, he was going to be executed for committing adultery between that crown and that moment, that sentence that was supposed there. Think about Matthew 25, when Jesus is calling people to visit and to be proximate to those who are within prison. And then really think about the end of Jesus' life. This is an individual who was arrested by the system of his day, who was tortured by the system of his day, was put through a trial by the system of his day, and was executed by that system of his day. And then rose from the grave, refuted those instruments of Satan's sin and death. So when we talk about who we worship, Christians worship a criminal. We've got to think what that means, what that means for us to live in light of. The other question that I want to ask us for the church is, who is my neighbor? And when Jesus was asked the question, his answer was the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? He talked about this man who was on this road who had a crime or an act of violence committed against him. And two people walked by who should have stopped. And the third was the shocking individual, the ethnic enemy of Israel at that time, this Samaritan. And it seems in that Jesus' answer, that question of who is my neighbor, is anyone who has need. And so as we think about those who have need, there are a couple ways that we can engage them. Our neighbors are both those that we live near. There's a geographic proximity, absolutely. And those are those that we are just beside, maybe where we live. And a neighbor is also somebody that you might stumble upon who has a need. And so I want us as Christians not only to seek out those that have needs, to make an active effort of that, but also to be ready to stumble upon the needs of others. Because a neighbor, for what Jesus' parable is, seems to be any individual who has needs. So those two questions animate a lot of how I think about how to call the church, think about the system of our day. Another thing I want to say to the church is talk about what's at the root of our criminal legal system. And I think the thing that's at the root of our criminal legal system is the very thing that fuels it, which is fear. There's a lot of shame and there's a lot of anger or guilt or emotion that gets expressed. And almost always underneath that is a fear-based response. Almost all violence likely can be traced back to some kind of shame or fear-based response to something. That doesn't excuse it, but that helps explain it. And our criminal legal system is constructed in such a way that it's based not off of how can we care for someone who has need, not how we can pursue some measure of healing, but how can we isolate someone out of fear? How can we have a place for those capital O others, those monsters, those people that we aren't and need to have removed from society? And it takes a lot of work to be proximate to those people. It's hard, emotionally and just logistically, to visit or go inside of a jail or prison. But when we think about almost one out of 100 individuals within the United States are within jail or prison, and if we think about, do we know somebody within that state? We start to see some of the rhythms and the ways in which we live. We should be stumbling on those individuals. And if we don't, it's really important to ask, in what way am I living where I'm not encountering a huge portion that are vulnerable within our population, especially as we consider that people who are within prison, 95% are going to come back out into the world. But fear is at the root of that, largely a fear of Black and brown people, but a fear of just harm in general. It fuels and it animates this system. And if we look at the way that we see the system responding in a cookie cutter way, all kinds of instances of crime or violence or harm, there's often a common response. It's fear-based. Something else I want to say to the church, and I used this word earlier, of idolatry. I think that we also, in the church in America as a whole, have an idolatry of punishment. That's connected to the other piece too. I think we have this in America, and in the church, a love of punishment, because underneath that is a fear of I might have to change, or I might be vulnerable, or I might be harmed. Therefore, I'm justified in execution, removal, extreme sentencing, over-policing, whatever that thing is that I'm using to stave off that harm or that danger or inconvenience to myself. It's fear-based, but it comes across in the response as a punishment. Now, we can talk about all sorts of things. One thing we'll talk about is the death penalty. There are lots of areas of the criminal legal system that we can dig into, but the death penalty is one space that it's easy to demonstrate some things. We know the death penalty is done in a racist way. We know that it's done in an arbitrary way. We know that the death penalty is incredibly expensive. We know that it doesn't deter crime. We know that it's not doing any of those logical or objective things that we really want it to do. So we can go through all that data and say, look, it's not doing any of these things except this. Someone wants someone to be punished. Or if in their imagination, when harm happens, the scales of justice are imbalanced, if some form of punishment they think balances that. Someone can think that, but then we're into philosophical and theological grounds. We've left that area, we're talking about some of these facts and what we can show with data, and we moved into a value system. My best and deepest conversations with people and the deepest wrestling with my soul at night has come from thinking about and talking about what do I really think punishment does? Ask that question as a parent of 3 kiddos, and that's weighty. I believe in a restorative criminal legal system or a restorative response to crime and harm for years before I applied it to my parenting. Was living in a really hypocritical way, still respond to my children with this response of fear and punishment and control. rather than thinking about what does restoration look like. I still think harm happens. Those scales of justice are imbalanced. But what is that thing that can help bring back some measure of balance, some measure of healing? And that's ultimately restoration, which is hard. To ask someone who's committed a harm, a crime, an act of violence, to face that person that they've engaged, hear from that person, for that person who did the harm to have the safety to be able to admit that they've done that, to admit they see what it's done to that person, and to have that person who was harmed to be able to be in charge of and empowered to say, this is what healing would look like for me. Our criminal legal system allows for none of those things that I just named. In fact, it fuels the absolute opposite of that. So I want us as a people thinking about what does it look like to respond to harm. I don't speak of our criminal legal system being broken anymore. I used to say that it's this broken system. I think it's more accurate to say that our criminal legal system is effective for what it wants to do, to the benefit of those that it wants to benefit, and to the harm of those that it wants to harm. And so I support those efforts of reform, but I don't know how far that can go. And a lot of work that we want to do within the world and at EJUSA is to come under and go ahead and empower and fuel and source and point people to who are those practicing community safety in these other ways. There's that phrase that's been out there in the justice world, a few people have picked it up, but we often say those who are closest to harm are often closest to the solution, and we want those people closest to power to be able to make these decisions about their safety. And again, our criminal legal system that isn't broken does not allow for that. So I'll end with this. James Baldwin has a lot of things that will wreck you to hear him say. But in 1963, he wrote a letter to his nephew. He was named after him. The boy's name was James. And James Baldwin wrote this letter, just a few pages long. It was in his book, Fire Next Time, and he said he tore it up several times. But he's writing as a black man to a black teenage boy and saying, here's how I want you to live and move within America. There's a lot within that letter, but one thing that wrecks me when I hear it is when he talks about these innocent people. And he's largely talking here about white people. And by innocent, he doesn't mean that they don't deserve some blame. He's talking about innocent in their ignorance, of them not knowing fully the impact of what it is that's going on. So I'll close with this. He said, for these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. When people, especially when white people, are often confronted with some of these realities, there's that response of fear, anger, and guilt. And that's absolutely not the goal. But on the very next page, Baldwin says why that reaction happens. And he says that most white Americans fear a loss of their identity. We fear the sacrifice. But the best thing about being a Christian is that as a Christian, you are able to offer up any part of your identity, your gender, your race, your socioeconomic status. All of those things can be offered up on the altar for the sake of our neighbor and the identity of being a son or a daughter of God. That piece doesn't change, but it begins with this reckoning, with the history, with an understanding of what's happened. Once we see that, we grow in our imagination a knowledge of what this history is, of why we are where we are, to quote Baldwin again, of what it means and why it is being this way as a black man within this country for him and for his nephew. Once we see those things, the goal, as Baldwin said, is release, or as Jesus said, is liberty. It's freedom from these confining things which Satan sent into that. So I want to call you to action. There's three things that I want you to think about. We're going to shift and hear from some local individuals doing this work. One way of responding to this is prayer. One way is asking God to open eyes, to reveal, to motivate, to continue to teach all of us of what does it mean to see the reality of the world and the broken ways even that I see it, and to live in light of what is real. So one, just pray. There's a specific way that I want you to pray. One way that we're going to pray as a nation, October 10th is World Day Against the Death Penalty. And if you registered for this event, you'll get an email link. We're having a national call to prayer to abolish the death penalty, but if you come to the call, you don't have to agree with that too. The call is going to be a helpful place to hear and pray with other Christians, just to consider some of these things. To question the death penalty doesn't mean that you're totally against it. But the death penalty, in a way, is kind of ground zero, I think, for how we think about and respond to harm as a country. So on October 10th, we're having Christians come together on Zoom to think through, to hear from others, to hear statistics, to hear stories, to hear music, and to pray and consider together how we as a nation can respond to one piece or branch of this criminal legal system. But the death penalty, in a way, is an intersection or a nexus of all these things. The second way to call you to action is we have a tool at the Evangelical Network, a resource that's called our Church and Justice tool. And it's a web page. And what it does is it walks you through, or a church that might go through it, through a theology of justice. What does it mean to be a Christian that loves justice? What does that mean, especially as we think about the criminal legal system? There's videos, there's text, there's great things there. But what makes the tool so wonderful is it ends at the bottom with 24 different hyperlinks of different organizations across the country to point you to that are doing that work. You want to dig deep on racial equity, there's things there. Death penalty, there's things there. Restorative justice, there's things there. Thinking about policing, there are things there. Wherever you want to go as you think about justice, there's likely a group or a space or a city thinking through and doing that work. And the goal of that tool is to help equip and connect churches to that. So you'll get a link to that as well. And the third way, and in a way the most important one, is to link arms with those here within Winston and at the state level in North Carolina doing that work. And that's what Noelle and Valerie and Reverend Ford are going to come up and talk about in a bit. So I call us to those things, to think about who our neighbor is, to think about what are ways that we can seek out a neighbor, what are ways that we can stumble upon a neighbor, and then respond to it. So we'll shift over now and start to talk with some of our panelists, and I'll pass it back to Liz.
Thanks, Sammy. So for those of you in the room, this is the part where you get something that virtual individuals don't, because we're actually going to turn off the live stream and the recording, because we know that when we're having authentic conversations and hard conversations and things that often people are in conflict about, sometimes there's the fear that what you say is going to be taken out of context and put into 120 characters and tweeted and used against you. That someone's going to hear something and not hear it right. They're going to think they heard your voice or saw the back of your head. And that could cause people to maybe not ask a question that they're really wondering about, not connect to a resource, not bring something up that maybe they want to say. So we're going to end the live stream and invite our panelists up so that hopefully we're catering really authentic, open conversations in this space. So the three of you are welcome now. And for the rest of you, there is snacks and stuff if you want to get up. We're a pretty casual crew. So if you want to take a second, grab a snack while they come up, and then we'll get started in just a moment.